And this is the set-aside prayer. God, please set aside everything I think I know about myself, my emotional sobriety, 12 steps, and you for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my emotional sobriety, the 12 steps, and especially you. Please help me see the truth. Amen.
And I am so excited. I did a little research because I didn't know anything about Rabbi Rami Shapiro. So I went to his website and oh my gosh, he is quite a man. He is going to be with us tonight to talk about the first two steps. Specifically, he's going to help us understand the God beyond our understanding and the difference between surrender and being surrendered. The rabbi is an author of too many books to count, but they all look like they are really important to certainly my life and my growth, and maybe yours too. I urge you to go to his website. It's RabbiRami.com. And with that, I'm going to turn it all over to Rabbi Shapiro to introduce himself and tell us what we need to know today. So we're really glad you're here, and I'm really excited. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Susie. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Rami. I am a food addict, recovering overeater, recovering at least for the last, it's 12:30 in the afternoon where I am. I got up at 5 o'clock this morning, so I know I've been recovering for the last 7 hours. I can't tell you what's going to happen in the next 7 hours, but I've got half a day almost under my belt today. What I'd like to do is spend a little time talking about Surrendered, not the book, but the concept, and then really open it up to dialogue. That is much more interesting, I think, to have a conversation than to just have you sit there and have me talk at you. But before I do any of that, I want to give you a little history about how I got involved in 12-step, and then I want to pick up on DJ's set-aside prayer. And then we'll go to the book. Because I think, honestly, I'd never heard of the set-aside prayer before, and I just loved that. So, but let me tell you how I got into this. This is the Surrendered book. I don't know if you've read it or not, but it's my second book on 12-step. In my first book, I think I tell this story, but I was sort of curious about 12-step, but had no need for 12-step because I'm not an addict. I am totally normal. I have no addictions. I have no problems. But I know there are people who have problems and they go to meetings, and I'm just curious what they do there. So I had a friend. I was on a retreat in upstate New York, and a friend of mine is a drug addict and an alcoholic, and she needed to find a meeting. And she located one. She didn't have a car. I said I'd drive her, but I wanted to attend the meeting. And, I don't know if this was something you can do or not, but she said, if I went in, it was an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. And she said, if I went in and as we qualified, if I said my name was Rami and I don't know if I'm an alcoholic, I wouldn't be lying because I don't know if I'm an alcoholic, because the fact is I've actually never had an alcoholic drink. I don't drink. I've tasted, when I was a kid, my parents let me taste alcohol once or twice, and I just hated it. I had a visceral response. I don't drink ritual wine for the holidays or on Sabbath. I only use grape juice. I just find alcohol literally just distasteful. So I don't know. Maybe if I liked it or I'd like the taste or I could swallow it or whatever, I might be an alcoholic. I don't know. So just say to them, she said, I don't know if I'm an alcoholic. So I went in, sat down, we went around the room. It was a large gathering. And I said, I don't know if I'm an alcoholic. And what they heard was, I'm in denial. They knew immediately I was an alcoholic, and they were going to help me face the truth of my alcoholism. And they told me their stories. And the idea was I would see myself in these stories, which I did not. I resisted that. I was blind to that, but I was captivated by their honesty and their integrity and their courage and the clarity of their self-knowing. I mean, I was in my 50s then. I'm in my 70s now. And I had spent decades in various spiritual communities and on different meditative retreats in Judaism and Christianity and Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Sufism. And I had never met people like this before. And I don't want to romanticize people in 12-step, but still, I was overwhelmed by the quality of these people. And so when the meeting was over and we had left, I said to my friend, boy, I wish I had an addiction because I would like to go to meetings. And she said, what are you talking about? I said, I wish I could go. I don't want to lie. She says, you're a food addict. I said, no, I'm not. What are you talking about? She says, you obsess about food all the time. You're always worrying about it, worrying what you're going to eat. And did you eat too much? I mean, where other people at a retreat are maybe obsessing about God, you're obsessing about lunch. All you do is think about food. I thought that was ridiculous, but I thought it was maybe an in to a meeting. So when I returned home, I did go to an OA meeting, Overeaters Anonymous. And I just listened to everybody's story, and they were telling my story. The only difference was they thought there was something wrong with eating out of the garbage, and I just thought everybody did that. So when I discovered that I actually do have a problem, that my eating wasn't clean and I wasn't sober when it came to this thing, on the one hand, I was shocked that there was this was something I needed to deal with. And on the other hand, I felt so blessed that somehow a mirror had been revealed to me that I could see myself in a way that I couldn't see myself before. So then I started to take this, as you all do, very seriously. But not only am I an addict, I'm a rabbi. And rabbis are trained to, I guess maybe the word in English is parse text, to go into texts and pull them apart. And I took on the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I began to pull it apart, not in a negative way, but to see what else is, what other layers of meaning are in the text that maybe we're not getting in the rooms, in the meetings. And the more I delved into it, the more I felt, and still feel, that what Bill W. did was offer a spiritual path, a universal spiritual path, outside the confines of the world's great religions, or take the adjective great out, outside the confines of religion. He offered a spirituality for the 20th and 21st century for those who didn't feel the need or comfortable in a formal religious setting, but a spirituality that was no less deep, no less challenging, no less potentially transformative, and no less difficult than any of the great mystical teachings of any of the great religions. But what I was seeing wasn't what people were experiencing in the meeting. Where I live in a very Christian town in Tennessee. It's very evangelical. The meeting was, back then, the meeting is overwhelmingly white evangelical Christians. And in a sense, if there's a great, and I believe there is, a great depth to 12-step, this was pretty shallow. And there was a lot of talk about a higher power, which we're going to spend some time on. There was a lot of talk about a higher power, but the higher power was not simply the God of your understanding, which was Jesus overwhelmingly, but God, because God was Jesus and there was no alternative. And that really isn't what 12-step is about. So my sense of what this is about and the sense of my friends in the meeting were very different. And I want to make that point because as I go into this, what I'm going to share is what I experienced working the steps and what I think is an authentic reading of the big book and comes out of my experience with 12-step in general. But I don't want to, it's not a critique of anyone else's practice of 12 steps. It's not a judgment on anyone else's reading of the steps. And it certainly isn't an attempt to impose my understanding of God on anyone else, even though my understanding is right. I mean, there's no question about that. But, I want you to do two things while I go into this. One is remind yourself that this is just Rami's idea. So and we're going to come to this in a second, but when we do this, the set aside prayer, set aside everything I know about myself and the rest of it, I want to take it up line by line. Set aside everything you think you know about me and everything that I think I know about God and all the rest of it. Just if you'd be kind enough to listen to what I have to say, that would be enough. You don't have to wrestle with it. You don't have to say yes. You don't have to say no. Just let it sit there. If something resonates positively, that's nice. If something resonates negatively, that's fine also. Don't get distracted by judging it or arguing with it. I'd love to have a conversation about what I'm saying. I'd love to hear what your positions are, but I don't want to have an argument because it's about our sobriety. It's not about who's right about our interpretations. So that's one piece. The other is, the one thing I do want everyone to walk away with, though I suspect if you've been in this long enough, you already know, that you are on, and everyone who takes 12 steps seriously is on a very deep and transformative spiritual path, which means it can get very scary. And we'll talk about why that is in just a little bit. So that's a little bit of my story. Now let's just pick up the set aside prayer. Like I said, I'd never heard this before. It's new to me. So if for nothing else, I gained this great gift today. So DJ, thank you for that. So God, I don't know what to make about that. We're going to talk about God, but okay. So let's just God, whatever that is. Please set aside everything I think. And then it goes, I know, but I'm going to stop right there. Set aside everything I think. All my thoughts are basically manufactured narratives from everything I've thought beforehand. So, when I write a book, this is an exaggeration, but basically I type. I can't think of what the word is. I transcribe stuff that just pops into my head. I write it down as fast as I can before I lose it. So my first, I'm always working on a book. I've written 36 and I'm working on another one. Stuff comes into my head and I write it down as fast as I can. I don't even know what I'm saying. And then I go back over it 100 times and I try to clean it up to see if it makes any sense. But I have to set aside everything I think in order to learn something. But I can't learn anything from what I already think. I'm learning from what I don't think yet. So let's put aside everything, that I think. And certainly everything that I think about, that I know about myself. Because one of the things that I discovered in my 12-step journey is that it's a constant peeling away of what I think I know about myself, both positive and negative. One of the things I love about 12-step is you're never done. You're the not being done isn't, oh yes, there's one more step, or there's always, you can always go deeper. There's always one more layer of illusion. There's always one more layer of this is maybe a little strong, but in my case, I would admit to this way. There's always one more layer of deceit. There's always one more lie I'm trying to pass to put over on myself. There's always one more delusion that I can say, oh, wait, that's not really right. Who am I performing that for? My kids, my grandkids, my spouse, my friends, myself? Can I identify all the BS that still comes up? And can I put that aside? Can I set aside, or can I have God set aside, my emotional sobriety? Now that's wild. God, please set aside everything I think I know about my emotional sobriety. Now, I don't know what you hear when you hear that, but what I hear is, you don't have any emotional sobriety. Your emotions are, you could say on one hand that I'm drunk on emotions. I'm moved around by them. You could say I'm addicted to my emotions, when in fact, if I can set aside whatever emotional sobriety means, that I'm in control of my emotions, or I have a steady state of emotions. If I can set aside whatever illusions I have on emotional sobriety and look to see what emotions really are, and this is true about thoughts, so it really goes with the first one about setting aside what I know about myself. Thoughts and feelings just arise. That's what the brain does. It thinks and feels all by itself. I don't even have to be conscious to have thoughts and feelings. I could be asleep, and my dream state will still have thoughts and feelings, and they can be very real, right? I had this happen to me a couple of months ago. I dreamt I was diving off a pool, and I actually dove off my bed and landed on the floor. Now, some doctor told me this was some other problem I've got and I have to check out. But I dove off the bed onto the floor. I woke up, sort of, found myself on the floor, but I was still dreaming. And I was convinced that someone had drained the pool of all the water. And that's why I was on the dry floor in an empty pool. But it seemed very real to me. But, my normal waking ego Rami was not there, but the thoughts and feelings were still there. If you practice mindfulness meditation, for example, or you practice, we won't go into this unless you ask, I guess, but, I'm a student of Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta Maharaj, Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, where the practice is you just look at the thoughts and feelings that arise, and you realize I'm not consciously thinking them. I'm aware of them, and then I get caught up in them, and I can learn how not to do that maybe, but I'm not in control of my thoughts and feelings. They just happen, and then I have to figure out what to do. So if I can set aside everything I know about my emotional sobriety and my thoughts about myself, I'll realize I've got all kinds of madness going on in the world of thoughts and feelings. But I'm really not that madness, because I can stand back and watch it. I can see the thoughts coming, and I can say, oh, look, there's that again. I can see the feelings coming and say, oh, look, there's that feeling again. I always get that feeling. And when you tie it into my addiction, I have to go to the supermarket later today. I have to do an errand for my wife. I have no idea what it's like if you're an alcoholic and you have to go into a bar or a liquor store. I mean, I imagine if it was me, I would try not to do that. But as a food addict, walking into the grocery store is a dangerous thing to do. And there's almost no aisle in the supermarket that I can walk down without finding myself triggered. In OA, they talk about trigger foods. So I can walk down the broccoli aisle the fruits and vegetables aisle, and it's never going to get me. But if I walk down the candy aisle, or if I walk down the chips aisle or something, it's like all those packages become animate objects calling my name, right? So whenever I go to the supermarket, even if I have something to get in a completely other part of the store, I find myself walking down these aisles that are very dangerous for me. And the call of these very dangerous foods is palpable. I hear it, I feel it. They're calling me by me, or just, sometimes what I used to do is just rip the bag open and then eat it in the store. Sometimes, pay for it, and sometimes, not. But anyway, I pay for it now, but now I don't do it. But, just eat the stuff mindlessly. Now what I do is just going back to the prayer, I can set aside somehow, not willfully, but in this way, God, my higher, my greater power, set aside whatever thoughts I have or feelings I have about emotional sobriety, and just look at the fact that I don't have it. Look at the madness that happens in the chip aisle and say, wow, look at that. But the me that's looking isn't being controlled by the madness that's happening, if that makes sense to you. So I love this prayer. So then it goes on. Set aside everything I know about myself, my emotional sobriety. Set aside everything I know about the 12-step. That's brilliant. Because it can become a fundamentalist kind of religion. It can become dogmatic. And when it becomes dogmatic, I don't think it works, because then it becomes a dunning. It becomes judgmental, and it's self-judgmental. You use it to hit yourself over the head for being less than perfect. So you have to set all that aside. It works, it works when you work it, if you work it, but it only works if you let it work. And by setting it up as a fixed thing and then working that fixed thing, it no longer works. And that's why we're going to talk about being surrendered. It works when you're not really in control, and the steps are allowed to do what they do, in a sense, on their own. But we'll get to that. It's not really exactly the true. So set aside what I know about 12-step, and set aside what I know about you with a capital Y, about God. And that's why we're going to talk about the God beyond our understanding, because there's a limit to the God of your understanding. And in this way, have an open mind and a new experience of myself, my emotional sobriety, the 12 steps, and especially the divine. I just think this is so important. If any of that can happen to any degree to me in the next hour, I will be incredibly grateful. And I'm going to write it down and use this, maybe expand it even, and use this on a regular basis. Because if this can happen to me on even daily, I can imagine starting my day with this. And you're basically saying, oh, God, please help me free myself from myself so I can have an authentic experience today that isn't simply an imitation of what I experienced yesterday. How amazing would that be? I was giving a retreat once on this kind of thing, and there was a retired psychiatrist in the group, and he told this story. It may be in one of these books, but it could be in any of my other books. But he told this story when he was an intern at a facility, and he was a newbie. He was getting his PhD in I think he had his MD, and then he was getting his PhD so he could be a psychiatrist. I think that's how it works. But anyway, they take the new interns and they give them the worst patients, he told us, because they can do the least amount of damage. So they gave him this kid who had been in institutions most of his life. He was 16, he told us, and he was chronically depressed. And they had a one-on-one meeting, and the doctor, the new doctor, the intern, said to the boy, so describe your depression. Now, in a sense, I don't mean this harshly, but just I think it's accurate. The boy was a professional patient. He'd been in this situation so many times. He knew what the psychologist or the psychiatrist or the social worker wanted, because he'd done this with different doctors so often. So he described his depression in great detail. And the intern says to him, okay, so let me ask you this. When you were talking about your depression, were you depressed? And the boy thought about it for a second. He said, no. And he said, okay, I want to work with the you that's not depressed, but that can observe your depression. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. When I look at the madness associated with my compulsive overeating, I can struggle to try to get rid of the madness, or I can realize I'm something so much bigger than that, and not find, I don't know if sobriety is the right word, but tranquility maybe is the right word. So let me give you another story. Where I am right now, I'm sitting in my home office. That's where I live and work here. And to my left is a door that leads to my kitchen. And at the far end of that wall, my kitchen wall, is the big refrigerator. And in the refrigerator are things that I should not eat, but my wife eats. And there are times during the day where I'm like an iron filing to a magnet, and the refrigerator just draws me to it. I find myself like just pulled up out of my chair and walking into the kitchen and opening the refrigerator door and then just looking for something to eat. I'm not hungry. I'm just in front of the open refrigerator looking for something to eat. And then my ego clicks in, and I hear two voices. One voice says, you've been working hard all day. You had a decent lunch. Go ahead, have whatever it is. I don't know. And you deserve it. And then the other voice says, are you kidding? You've eaten well all day. You're going to blow it right now for no good reason. And the other voice says, no, go ahead, eat it. And the second voice says, no, don't eat. And it's just this war going on. There's nothing like tranquility or sobriety. It's just this madness happening. If I try to get into that fray, my experience is the go ahead and eat it voice always wins. Always. If I step back and just listen to the two of them, I get a sense of, even though I'm talking about myself, I get a sense of, these guys are nuts. What is their problem? And I step back, I close the refrigerator door, and I go back to my office. I'm not fixing the problem. I'm observing the problem. And the me that's observing, like the kid who's observing the depression, that kid was not depressed. He's observing the depression. The level of consciousness that's observing the madness of my addiction or my fight against my addiction, the observer me isn't caught up in the addiction or the fight against the addiction. It's just aware of it. I don't even think I'd say detached, because it's not. I'm not saying, oh, that's not me. I'm just saying I am so much bigger than that. I can rest in my greater self, and we're going to talk about greater power in a second. I can rest in that greater sense of who I am and allow the lesser voices to do whatever they're going to do, and they won't impact me. Now, when I get back to work, I don't hear them anymore. I don't even know if they're there. So what I'm looking for isn't equanimity, isn't silence, isn't to put an end to my addiction, but to realize I'm so much bigger than the addiction. I don't know if that makes sense or not, honestly. I don't know if it makes sense to any of you who are listening. But that's how I understand what's going on. So when I look at my emotional, I think this is true for everybody if they look at it, the emotional turmoil of your life, because you're having all these attractions and repulsions constantly. I mean, that's what Buddhism shows you that you're always grasping at something or repelling from something, and it's just going on and going on and going on. If you can just stand back and go, boy, that's nuts, or don't even say that, that's a judgment. Forget that. Just step back and go, look, repulsion and attraction, repulsion, attraction, repulsion, attraction. But the observer, the greater I, which is what we're going to call it shortly, this larger reality, isn't stuck in that repulsion and attraction. Not even to the extent of having to stop it, just not being caught up in it. And that's where I guess we could say my recovery lies, in realizing my true nature, and realizing that true nature is so much larger than my addicted self. My addicted self with a lowercase s, as opposed to my true self with the capital S. And again, I don't know if that makes sense, but let me go into this more detail, and then we'll open it up to comments, and we can flesh that out if it doesn't. Or I could be wrong, right? So, that's why we started, let's put aside everything that, we think we know and everything Rami thinks he knows. So let's pick up the first 3 steps, because that's really what the Surrendered book is about. And let me, because sometimes people don't get the title. So surrendered, not in the sense of, if someone says, oh, I'm a recovered alcoholic, I'm a recovered addict of one kind or another. That's not what I mean. Like you're finished with that, as opposed to I'm a recovering addict. So you're always working on it. That's not the way I'm using the word surrendered in the past. I'm not using it in the past tense. I'm using it in the passive tense, that I have been surrendered by a greater power, not by my own act of surrender. And that's what we're going to get into. So let's take the first 3 steps. So we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, over food, over sex, over drugs, over whatever you want, that our lives had become unmanageable. So in my reading of this and my understanding of my own life, I would expand it. And this is where I think 12-step goes ultimately as a spiritual practice, that I have to admit that I'm powerless over everything. That Rami, the ego, right? The small s self, I don't control anything. I mean, I try constantly, right? But I can't control my spouse. I can't control my son or his wife. I can't control my 2 grandsons. I got one is 7. He's he's moving into a stage where he's fighting for his autonomy. So anything you say, he says no, right? And then I have an 8-month-old grandson, and he has no idea what, he doesn't know about control. He's just doing what he's doing, and you can't control. He falls asleep when he's tired. He's a perfect Zen monk. When he's hungry, he eats. When he's tired, he sleeps. And when he's got to poop, he poops. And that's it. So you can't control any of that. I don't think I control anything. Stuff just happens. And I wouldn't even say it happens to me. I'm not a victim. It happens with me. There's just happening. And I'm part of the happening. One of the brilliant things that we're going to get to again in step 3, but one of the brilliant things that the Bible, now I'm Jewish, but I'm not going to say the Bible is the truth or is better than Bhagavad Gita, or the Tao Te Ching, or any of the other sacred texts. I love them all. But one of the things I love about the Hebrew Bible is its its name for God. When Moses meets God at the burning bush. And to me, the Bible is story, not history. So in the story of Moses meeting God at the burning bush, Moses inquires into the nature of divinity. That's what it means when Moses says, "What's your name?" And whoever wrote the story or originally told the story was a genius, just a spiritually awake being. And so the first thing that the author has God say when Moses says, "What's your name?" or "What's your true nature?" God's response is Ehyeh, which means I am. God is the eternal subject. God is the singular, non-dual I happening as all reality. There's just one thing in the universe, or the universe is one thing, and it's happening as all things. Then immediately after you get that, because it's from the Hebrew verb to be or to happen, it's the first person verb to be. So I'm the being, not with a capital B like a being or a supreme being, but I'm the verb being that's being everything that's in existence. And then the next thing that God says in the story, it gives a second name, and that's the unpronounceable. In Hebrew, it's Yud He Vav He or YHVH. In German, there's no Y, so they use a J, and that's where they get Jehovah from. So it's the YHVH. It's the third person form of the same verb to be. So one is first person, the other is third person. But it's the same thing. It's just the universe happening. That's the nature of God. God is the happening of all happening. So life isn't happening to me. Life is happening with me. I'm part of the process, good, bad, or indifferent. I'm just part of this. Nothing is being done to me. Everything is being done with me. So I admit that I'm powerless over it because I'm just a part of it. I'm not in control of even my little bit. I can't control, for the most part, and I would say really none of it, but I can't control my thoughts. They just pop into my head. I can't control my feelings. They just pop into my head. I've taken seminars where they'll tell you, if you could only think positive, you'd be fine. If you could only feel loving thoughts and not fearful thoughts, you'd be fine. I don't doubt that's true, but I don't know what I've thought. I don't know what I'm thinking until I've thought it. I don't know what I'm feeling until I felt it. And by then it's too late. If I know I'm feeling fear, it's because I've already felt it. So I'm behind the curve all the time. I don't think you can control those things. Now, you may disagree, and that's fine, but I don't believe I can control my thoughts and feelings. I have some influence over my behavior, but even then, science tells us that much of what we do is determined subconsciously before the ego conscious mind even knows you're doing. So I would say I've admitted that I'm powerless over everything. And that my life, when I try to have power or control over it, is unmanageable. That's when life becomes unmanageable, when I'm trying to be in control. That's why I think in the big book, when Bill W. says the first thing we have to do is to stop playing God, because that's playing at being in control. If I stop playing God, then I just let the thing happen. And what I discover when I let it happen is it has its own flow. And I can navigate within that flow. Now, navigation sounds like a kind of control, and maybe it is. And so maybe I'm hedging my bets. But in the current science of whirlpool, a riptide used to be, the natural response you get I used to live in Florida. I lived there for 20 years, and they always taught us what to do if you're caught on the beach in a riptide. And the riptide is pulling you out to sea, and you panic. And the natural response is to swim to shore, directly to shore, which is to swim against the tide. You get exhausted and you drown. So now they tell you that then. So when I lived there, I left in the 80s. So I got there in the 80s. So in the 80s to 2000, they used to say, swim parallel to the shore. Don't swim to the shore because you'll tire out and drown, but swim parallel to the shore and you can swim out of the riptide. They don't tell you that anymore. Now what they tell you to do is don't swim, just relax. And the tide will carry you all the way out as far as it's going to carry you, but it's a circle. And then it's going to carry you all the way back into the shore. If you can just let go And even if you're panicking, don't fight it. Just let the tide take you out, and the tide will take you back. Trust the tide. So that's what I think we can do. We can trust that process. But my life is unmanageable when I try to manage it. That's point one. I came to believe, and we have to talk about how that happens, in a power greater than myself or greater than ourselves that can restore me to sanity. So I have to talk about what sanity is. How do I come to believe? It's not rational. It's not that I read a book, though you should read all 36 of mine. It's not a rational process. I came, and I don't like the word belief for me personally. I like knowing. I came to know what I know through intuition. I came to know what I know through dreams. Not all my dreams, but some have just been so powerful that I can't deny the message I think I'm getting. I came to know what I know through dream. I came to know what I know through meditation practice, through other just sort of sparks of intuitive knowing, but not through reason, not that I figured it out. And in the context of 12-step, and this I think is incredibly important, I came to know what I know through the grace of rock bottom. I think before we talk about the grace of God delivering us, I think we should talk about the grace of God shattering us. And this is where the great truth of the Christian myth comes in. And the word myth is not meant in any disparaging way. The word myth is meant in the way Joseph Campbell uses it. A myth is a story we tell that conveys a great truth that can't be told in any other way. The great truth of Christianity is the truth of crucifixion and resurrection. The mistake, I would say, as a rabbi, right? So the mistake I would say that the institutional Christian church makes is that only Jesus gets crucified and only Jesus gets resurrected. But in fact, Jesus says, follow me, not worship me. Jesus in the Bible says, follow me. And where's he going? He's going to the cross. The cross of, in our case, the cross of ego, the cross of addiction, the cross of thinking you can control things, the cross of trying to have to manage your life. When you're crucified on the cross of addiction or the cross of control or the cross of manageability, you die to everything you think you know. That's the grace of crucifixion. That's the grace of rock bottom. And then what happens? Resurrection. But you have to go through that harrowing point of feeling abandoned. That's why in Mark's gospel, the second gospel of the New Testament, but the first gospel to be written historically, in Mark's gospel, Jesus says only one thing on the cross. Later, other writers add other things. But in the original gospel, the gospel according to Mark, Jesus is hanging on the cross. He's dying. And the last thing he says before he dies is, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. It's verse 1 of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? And read through a 12-step lens, we should read it, my God, the God of my understanding, the God of my understanding, why have you forsaken me? It's the God of our understanding, the God that we think is going to keep us from actually hitting rock bottom. That's the God that has got to die with us for us to really be crucified, for us to really be shattered through hitting rock bottom. Because otherwise, we're always hedging our bets and we're never going to be resurrected. We're never going to reach the freedom that 12-step offers. So, we can ask lots of questions. I invite questions about that. But so we came to believe in a power greater than ourselves. I don't know why this is, but the word that at least in English, that the big book uses and that 12-step, listing of the 12 steps uses, is a power greater than, not higher. When I go to meetings, everyone talks about their higher power. No one talks about their greater power. And those are not the same thing. A higher power is something separate from me. So I'm here, and then my higher power is up here, and I got to bridge that gap. Or I got to say, God, please help me, reach down, do something, lift me up, save me, whatever it is. But a greater power is just something that is bigger than me, but includes me. That's what I think the divine reality is. Whether we call it Tao, or we call it Brahman, or we call it Kali, or nature, or mother, or Dharmakaya, if you're a Buddhist, or mind, if you're a Buddhist, or the unpronounceable four-letter name of God, that's the being that is all being. Whatever your name for this greater reality is, it includes and transcends you. The Hindus have one of the best metaphors for this, or the analogy of the ocean and the wave. Think of the greater power as the ocean, and everything else in the universe are waves of the ocean. So I'm a wave of this infinite divine ocean. If I try to go it alone, which is absurd, I can't. Nothing works. But if I recognize that I'm part of the infinite ocean, I have suddenly oceanic power. That's what I was trying to get at when I'm standing in front of the refrigerator. My little wave is going, eat, don't eat, eat, don't eat. But if I step back into the oceanic, which is also me, this huge booming, eat, don't eat, becomes eat, don't eat, eat, don't eat. It becomes quieter and quieter and quieter till I don't hear it at all anymore because I'm too big. Not in the negative sense of compulsive overeating, but in the spiritual sense of I and God are one. And I find comfort in that. I find sanctuary in that giant self that is my true nature. So I came to believe, through hitting rock bottom in my case, I think, in a power greater than myself, of which I am a part, who can restore me to sanity by restoring me to my true self with the capital S. That's sanity. When we're restored to our true self. Hinduism is so clear about this. Atman is Brahman. Yourself, your true nature, is the divine nature. Tat tvam asi. You are that. I mean, Hinduism just doesn't pull any punches regarding that. Jesus says the same thing when he says, I and the Father are one. I am the way, the truth, and the life. It's the same message. The problem is Christianity sees Jesus as unique rather than paradigmatic. In Hinduism, everyone is Atman. Everyone says Atman is Brahman. I am the divine. But in other traditions, it's harder to get away with that. They think you're a heretic. And then the last one, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand God. So this is key for me, is this third one. My study of spiritual traditions, spiritual practices, spiritual systems, more than practices, my study of spiritual systems suggests that every one of them has a trick, has somewhere in there's a place where they pull the rug out from under you. They set you on this path. Do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, and you're going to get there. It's going to be great. Everything's going to be fine. And then at some point, they pull the rug out from under you and nothing works. And it's that pulling out of the rug that is the key to salvation. I spent 10 years practicing Zen Buddhism after I graduated, or just even as I was starting when I was graduating college. And I graduated as my undergraduate degree, and I went on and got my graduate degree in Judaism. I went to rabbinical school. I established a synagogue based on the stuff that you and I are talking about. And after about 10 years of practice, I kept up my Zen practice at a Zen center, even when I had my synagogue. And I wasn't any closer to enlightenment, whatever that is, than I was when I started. So I contacted my teacher, not my Zen master, because I was too intimidated to call him. So I called my teacher and I said, I've done everything you taught me, and I've done it for a decade, and I'm no closer to having a shift of consciousness than I was before. And he goes, you should come and see me. So he's deceased, but he lived in Massachusetts. My family all lives in Massachusetts. I was in Florida, Miami. So I flew up to see my family, and then I took some time, borrowed my mother's car, and went up to see him. We talked a little bit. We went out to a Japanese restaurant. He's Japanese. We went to a Japanese restaurant for lunch, went to a beautiful new Japanese garden that the university built in his honor, because he was getting ready to retire. And we're sitting in this garden, and I repeated my issue, 10 years of practice, getting nowhere. And I said, what's going on? Why doesn't it work? And he says, it's not working because it doesn't work. It's sort of like you say, it works if you work it. And then he's saying, but it doesn't. I said, what do you mean it doesn't work? He says, look, the whole idea behind Zen is you can do this. You, Rami, the wave, not the ocean. You, Rami, the small S self, you can get enlightened. You can sit on those cushions. You can study the koan, the mind-cracking puzzles. You can do this all by yourself. And he says, but you can't. It doesn't work that way. That little S self has to be shattered. Rami has got to die. He didn't use that term, but that's the idea. Rami has got to die. In Hebrew, it's called kalti nafshi, the annihilation of the self. And unless that happens, nothing happens. I said, well, why didn't you tell us that, years ago when I was at the college? And he says, because you wouldn't have listened to me. You wouldn't have understood it. You had to spend 10 years banging your head against the wall until you realized your head wasn't going to crack and the wall wasn't going to crack. So now that you know for a fact that you can't do this, it's going to happen in a different way. So made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. I don't think you can do that. Because the you that we're talking about, the you that's making a decision, is the you that's powerless. If I could make a decision, if Rami, the small S self, could make a decision to turn my will and my life over to care of God, which for me is the universe, right? Is this capital S, infinite oceanic reality. If I could simply make an egoic decision, say, yep, God, take it. I don't need the 12 steps. I wouldn't be an addict. I would be fine. I would have no problems. I'd turn it all over to God if I could do that. But the problem is the me that would say, oh, take it all, God, would be saying it to the God of my understanding. And the God of my understanding is just a projection of the little s self that I identify as me. It's a vicious circle. The little me imagines God as a image of myself, and I'm turning it over to myself. My ego is simply turning it over to itself, wearing a mask of God, and saying, here, take it. I'm going to be fine now. And it doesn't work. This is where the rug is pulled out from under us. And this is where the change can happen. Because ultimately, it's like we said at the very beginning, it's the God beyond my understanding, the God that I cannot understand. That is the real, that is the reality we're trying to recognize or realize. Because the God of my understanding is just another figment of my ego's imagination. It's just another aspect of my addiction, in a sense. But the God that I cannot understand is the God beyond my ego. But it's a God I can experience when the ego is shattered by the everyday experience of hitting rock bottom, by the everyday experience of the madness of my emotional insobriety, the madness of my mind, when I can see the chaos that's happening in here and the chaos that renders around me and realize I can't stop it. When that becomes absolutely, that can become so intense that it shatters the me that's doing it. And that is a kind of death. And every spiritual practice talks about certain death. The Sufis call it learning to die before you die. When you have that little death, the death of the ego, the greater self, which is God, is resurrected, is freed, is liberated, takes over. And then everything changes. There's still chaos. There's still, you're not free from addiction. The little you is not free from addiction, but you aren't that. You are this. You are the big S. And that's the salvation. And that's when you can do the moral accountability. And that's when you can make amends. And you can't make amends from the same mindset that made the problem in the first place. You have to shift. And the shift happens when the problem-making self is shattered. That's the great gift of Christianity, is the crucifixion. People want to jump the crucifixion, go right to the resurrection. It doesn't work that way. You have to get crucified. You have to go into Egypt in Jewish language. You have to go into exile. You have to leave Eden. You can't just hang out there. You have to go into those, the dark night of the soul, if you're going to come into the light and be transformed from the small s to the capital S self, to realize your own divinity. And I think that's the promise of 12-step. Not that I've ever heard that said in a meeting, but that's what I think is really going on here.